Welcome, everybody. I'm Alan Levin, and this is the next installment in my occasional YouTube and podcast series, Crossing the Boundary. Today, I'll be talking with Jeff Kitzes. Jeff was initiated as a Zen master in the Korean Zen tradition, the Kwan school of Zen, and was given the name Bon Soeng, which means original nature, by his principal teacher, Zen Master Seung Sahn. He's the leader of Empty Gate Zen Center in Berkeley, Boise, Idaho. They have centers in both places and also online. And he leads retreats in many parts of the world. He offers teachings, which are called Dharma talks, through recorded videos and directly with his students at retreats, and where those retreats include individual interviews and koan practice. Jeff is also a licensed psychotherapist with a practice in the Bay Area, and he has been a very good friend of mine for over 20 years. And I'm very happy to share this conversation with you and give him another opportunity to share some of the Dharma, the Buddhist teachings. At the sites where this conversation is available, I'll post more information on how to learn more about Jeff and Empty Gate Zen Center. I always make it a part of this series of interviews to look at crossing boundaries, how individuals take a step or a leap in their lives into a very different psychological, political, or spiritual orientation, and explore what it is that brought about that change in the way of their thinking, their actions in the world. And so that'll be part of our conversation today. I just learned, Jeff, from listening to one of your many YouTube talks, that you took an interest in meditating when you were 14 years old. And you think you were maybe influenced by the Beatles, who at that time were tripping with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. You were trying to meditate for several years, finding yourself confused, and attended a retreat in 1979 with Zen Master Seung Sahn, and you became his student and stayed with that path for all these years. Let's start with your early years. Um, what kind of home reality did you grow up in? I know your family was Jewish. Was there an interest in religion or spirituality with your parents, your grandparents, your life in the community? Did you feel a sense of being Jewish, having a Jewish identity?
Thanks, Alan. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Yes, I started meditating. The first time I meditated when I was 14, and to put it into context, that would be 1967. So I think it may even be the year that Sergeant Pepper's came out. The world was really changing, and I can't exactly say why I thought or knew to meditate, but that's the only thing that, looking backwards, I could come up with. But yeah, I grew up in a Jewish family, and my father's family comes from a very, very long line of rabbis that goes back to really the primary assistant to the Baal Shem Tov in Eastern Europe, the founder of the Hasidic religion, or the Hasidic sect of Judaism. And as I understand it, generation after generation after generations, there were rabbis in the family. I believe it was my great-grandfather broke that chain. My grandfather, my father's father, actually was a communist and very, very anti-religious. So my father was totally anti maybe a little bit strong, but he had no spiritual beliefs at all. He grew up poor and was in gangs and had a pretty tough childhood. When he was 17 years old, it was the middle of the war in World War II, and he decided he wanted to go kill Hitler. So he signed up to be in the infantry, actually. But when finally I was born, I was born, we were living in Brooklyn, but 6 months later, we moved out to Long Island. So I grew up a suburban existence. But interestingly, I've been looking at it now and I realize my parents moved to, especially by the time I was 8. When we moved when I was 8, we moved into a pretty Jewish suburban community. I think my high school might have been like 50% Jewish. So I lived in the culture, but I often felt like an alien from that culture. I went to Hebrew school. It was a zoo. I didn't think there was I didn't know anything about spirituality, and it didn't seem spiritual to me at all. In fact, many of our teachers in Hebrew school had been in Auschwitz. And at that time, I don't know, the only thing I could think is that the community was in shock. Nobody explained anything to us, and kids used to make fun of the numbers on the arms of the teachers from Auschwitz. I mean, it was just despicable. And looking backwards, none of the adults did anything to stop it. My grandfather, my mother's father, lived with us. He was religious, but not spiritual. So it looked very empty to me, and I had absolutely no interest in it.
What were some of the transitions or shifts that took place in your thinking or your sense about spirituality, where you directed your attention? What beliefs or orientations were you drawn to over time, and maybe as a teenager or a young adult?
Yeah. When I was a teenager, remember back to the late 60s. I mean, things were very transitional and exciting. And I was actually, for a guy who wasn't into Judaism, I was part of a Jewish youth group. And in the youth group, we started doing sensitivity sessions. That's where I first learned about psychology, I would say. And I started learning about myself. I remember being 15 years old at a party saying to people, I just want to know who I am. And of course, that's a teenage thing to say, but it's actually a question that never left me, and it's still my driving question.
What other influences
Well, I'd
continued
have
to
to
change?
say, to be real honest, since you keep asking, I would say my first time smoking marijuana made a huge difference. It opened up something in me that I now see as my spiritual center. I had awareness of things that I never knew before, and it started pushing up against the confines of what I believed. And it just, all those things together, and the political moment of the day. I mean, I was pretty deeply involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement when I was in high school, and the civil rights movement, although really peripherally to that. And I just was looking for a way to change the world. And I think ultimately I found that my spiritual practice was the way I could move forward in my life and try to do that.
What brought you to go to the retreat with that? I guess was a very big change in your life when you where you met your
Yeah,
teacher. What were you thinking when you went there? Did you know this
yeah,
was going to be your path, or were you exploring a
yeah,
lot of different
no.
paths? Or
Well, just one little change to your introduction. I started meditating when I was 14. I did it a little bit through high school, but not that much. My sophomore year in college, I took a course in transcendental meditation, and I started doing that in college. And also in college, I didn't want to follow the usual route towards middle class lifestyle and corporate work and all that. So my parents had to work very hard to keep me in college. And when I got out, I took a trip, actually, I was going to northern Mexico to look for Don Juan from the Carlos Castaneda books. I never made it because the guy I was traveling with had fallen in love. It's a complicated story. He went home. I ended up in California. And I ended up in the town of Mendocino. The night before I left, serendipitously from Washington, D.C., my sister-in-law was teaching in a high school. And she told me she was telling one of the shop teachers where I was going. And the shop teacher said, well, he might like Mendocino. It's a crafty town. And I was alone and I didn't know where to go. So I went to Mendocino and it really worked out for me. And a month later, I found a small Zen community. And that's in 1975. And that's really where I started practicing Zen. Flash forward 4 years later, I was in a miserable time in my life. The woman who's now my wife, at that time, she left to go to San Francisco, or actually Berkeley. And I went back to the small Zen community I was living in. I was miserable, and I saw a flyer for a 7-day meditation retreat with Zen Master Seung Sahn. I didn't know anything about him. I just knew I was miserable and I needed to do something. And I would say one of the marks of a Zen student, when you're miserable, you go practice. So I hopped in my truck and I went to Berkeley and I sat the retreat. And then I moved into the Zen Center at the end of the retreat.
Were you immediately moved by him? Was there something that some qualities that you saw or felt when you were with
He
him?
was so alive. He was a real human being. He was funny. He had so much energy. And I mean, it is true, the way he languaged the Dharma spoke to me. And it's still a language that I use today. But it was more his being, what I felt from him as maybe the fruit of his practice that really hooked me in. He was so dynamic and alive. Everything was funny when you'd be around him, and everything was a little bit surrealistic. And I really enjoyed that.
What do you mean, surrealistic?
Just being with him, it almost felt like everything was turned a little bit sideways. He would laugh at things that people wouldn't see as funny. He would just, he was a little bit, he was very yang. He's the kind of guy, he'd walk in a room and he'd take over the whole room. And when he did that, everything was humorous and funny. And I just loved it.
Beautiful. Yeah. Is there, this may sound like a silly question, but is there like an elevator talk, a capsule way to just explain what is Zen anyway? Why is it and you could add to that, why is it different than what people think of as Buddhism? If there is a difference.
Yeah, well, let me start with the first part. We start with the question, what am I? That was our kind of Zen is an inquiry practice. So we start with the question, what am I? What is this? Remember myself back at 15 asking, I just want to know who I am. It's like a match made in heaven. And it's investigating, being curious, using curiosity and wonder to experience the world, not knowing rather than coming from a place of knowing. So Zen literally means meditation. So there's lots of different forms of meditation. Zen, coming down from Bodhidharma way back in if he existed at all, way back in the 400s in China, was a transmission mind to mind outside the sutras. So it's not about learning something, it's about experiencing and actualizing something. And that's really all I'm interested in. I'm not a scholar. I kind of know about the sutras, but I don't study them. I study my own life and not peripherally, but connected to that, the lives of others, because now I'm a psychotherapist. I work with people. but it's very much about, very specific to life itself. It's not theoretical.
Would you say it's correct to say that the experience, like you're saying, it's about experience that's sought through Zen teachings and practice is an altered state of consciousness? That is, in this sense, that it's a very different state of consciousness from the ordinary way in which we experience ourselves in the world.
That's a tricky question. I guess I'd punt and say it's both and. It's
Uh-huh.
an it's a non-ordinary experience that brings us back to a very ordinary experience, one that gets lost by the defenses and the kind of the personal cage we put around ourselves to protect ourselves. It's more of a direct experience without a lot of a lot of protections between self, if we can say that, and the world. It's a becoming one
Mhm.
rather than being separate.
Oh, well, okay, so non-ordinary, altered states of consciousness, those are terms often used to refer to psychedelics. You may remember or know of the book Zigzag Zen, which was written by or edited by Alan Badner and artwork by Alex Gray. Came out in 2002, quite a while before what's happening now, which people are calling the psychedelic renaissance. And psychedelics have gone mainstream. There's research programs going on in universities and hospitals all over the country, all over the world, really, as well as legalization efforts and lots of coverage in the mainstream media. So, in a way, psychedelics have come out of the closet, and what was the case for a long period of time was that spiritual groups pretty much banned the use of substances. I know most Buddhist groups did for perhaps good reasons, but certainly partly because it was illegal and just bad press. And so that's sort of changing. And I'm wondering how I think I've heard that some Buddhist groups and some spiritual groups have now been integrating the use of psychedelics. Anyway, it's a big subject, and I just wonder. One of the things that comes out of the Zigzag Zen book, which again is 20 years old, was the revealing that many of these Buddhist teachers um, who had a range of views on the usefulness or not of psychedelics, but a lot of them said that their own introduction, sort of like you just said about your early experience with cannabis, brought them to this search to begin with. It made them have, offered them an experience that they then sought to have by meditation means or other
Mm-hmm.
spiritual practice means. So anything you want to share about that in terms of your own journey or your students or what you've been observing about uh, the usefulness or not of spiritual practice, of psychedelics combined with spiritual practice and so forth?
Well, first of all, my sense is it's a very personal decision.
Mhm.
Our Zen community never banned it. We don't, it's not part of our practice. We have a very specific practice offering, and psychedelics are not part of that.
Mhm.
But first of all, I would throw cannabis in the class of psychedelics,
Yep,
actually. And I
properly
don't think
used.
that's really talked about enough, and I don't think people are
Mhm.
aware of it enough.
Mhm.
But psychedelics were important in my journey. Um, I think it's simply that we to open to our spiritual lives, we need to be thrown out of our usual way of thinking. And substances like psychedelics can do a really good job of breaking out of the, again, I think earlier I called it the prison of our conceptual self. We create a conceptual self, reify it, and live inside of that, and we're trapped in our own prison. So psychedelics were and are a tool to break it open. I think, especially years ago, I don't know if people even think about it this way now, but one can use psychedelics and it's very helpful, but it's not a sustainable lifestyle, day in, day out. So Buddhist spiritual practices like meditation, bowing, chanting, all the things that we do are a kind of everyday form of psychedelic to help with that process. Sometimes you got to call in the heavy guns. Sometimes you use what is just ordinary and natural. And I think every single person has the human right to make their own choices about that. So I guess that's all I'd say. It's helpful. Especially younger students now, when they're coming in, they definitely talk to me about it. There's nobody has to hide anything. We just talk about it and use, in Zen, one of my great grand teachers, I'm going back to like the 1860s and 70s. And he said, to practice, you have to be like a good carpenter. An ordinary carpenter just uses the best wood, but a good carpenter will use everything. So this whole world is at our disposal. And I don't know everything, so I can't tell you what to do. I can work with you while you're doing it and help you work it. But I may be a little different than most, and maybe most teachers, but I really believe in individual human rights, and I don't believe in the teacher being the decider. The teacher is the helper. The student is the important person in the relationship. And each person has to find their own way. And other people's judgments, beliefs, ideas, they impact us, but each person has to find their own way. And I don't want to take the position that I know better than you.
Right. All right.
And it's definitely just the second part, it's definitely around more. It never went away. People were always talking about it. New people would come in and they would ask me. It's more mainstream now, but people would come to Zen all through the 2000s. It was always here. And great, whatever works for you is wonderful. Everything is a double-edged sword. Anything can be enlightening, and you can get attached to anything and then make that part of your conceptual framework, and it becomes part of your prison. So the specifics of what it is doesn't matter. It's how you use it and how open you keep your mind.
Right. Many people are aware, even people that haven't immersed themselves in Zen practice, that know that Zen is known for asking questions and not expecting answers in a literal sense of rational words that say, well, okay, this is what the answer to that question is. In some of your talks, I know that you emphasize the question, what am I? That's a basic core question. Or some people say, who am I? I don't know if you distinguish between who am I and what am I, or even what is this? You've heard you say, like, what is this? Meaning anything, anything. What are you getting at with that?
Well, let me first say the difference between who and what. Who makes it into an object. And I don't believe we're actually objects. I think we're
Mhm.
process, that our minds make us into a fixed self that is a who. So I specifically don't use who am I. I use what am I, because what is a way more open question. Once I say who, it implies to me this body, this mind. When I say what, it includes the whole universe. So I think who is too narrow and too small. My opinion. Other people
Mhm.
have a different view of it.
Yeah, it's
But
the
to
way the
me,
words strike you. Yeah.
yeah, so what is very important. And actually, I've come to the point where what is the question.
Mm.
What opens things up? When I was in graduate school, I was told, don't ask why, because why brings you into your head.
Uh-huh.
Zen is experiential. It's not theoretical, really. I mean, there's plenty of teaching and there's lots to talk about, but ultimately that's Dharma candy. What matters is my and your own experience. And that's a what question. It's not a who or a why question. So I've come to a point where I think of the basic question as what, and meet that moment of what with curiosity and wonder and effort and energy. And that's Zen practice.
Mm. So what am I? Even shortening it to just what?
Yes. You know, it comes
What?
from a koan style practice.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And without getting too much into the intricacies of koan practice, I have read that, you know, a lot of times there's Japanese style, there's Chinese style, there's Korean style. Each of these countries have a different way of practicing, really.
Mm.
Even though Zen is an overarching view, there's a lot of similarity, but there are differences. And I've read a scholarly paper that talked about koan practice in Korea, where essentially you use a question to raise great doubt. And when you're fully in great doubt, they say it's like your whole body becomes a question mark.
Mm.
And they said at that point, you can throw away the question
Mm.
because you're not really looking for an answer. In some ways, you can answer a koan, but once you do that, you kill it. It's over. Before you answer it, it's alive. The
Mm.
point is raising great doubt, raising that curiosity and wonder, experientially, not theoretically. The answer is much less important than the question.
It sounds like as I listen to you, it feels like the questioning leads to what I think of as just openness, just open.
Yes.
Uh,
What came to me as I was talking, and then you said it, is aliveness. To
Aliveness.
me,
Uh-huh.
I've come to a place, and you know, I'm 70 years old now. I've been doing this my whole adult life. Really, practice is about being alive at the moment of creation. Right now, can I
Mm.
really be here? Not hiding behind my protection, but
Mm.
exposed completely, giving my entire being or the entire universe to this moment
Mm.
and being alive. That's
Yeah.
what I'm interested in. To me, that's the gift of practice. It's the
Mm.
possibility of really being alive, really being human.
Mm.
The whole I realize I've been quoting the wrong person all along, but from Zorba the Greek, he talked about the full catastrophe.
Uh-huh.
It's not about having a curated good life.
Mhm.
It's about being completely alive in the face of all of it, all
Mhm.
the messiness, the confusion. People come into practice thinking they're going to have this calm, easy, lovely existence, no problems, no hindrances.
Mhm.
And honestly, to be a little crude, I think it's all bullshit. What you find is you're a human being is a massive contradiction. And we have energy, we have passion, we have love, we have hate, all of it. And we have to be alive to it and work with it, but we have to be alive to it, not cut it off. You know, that phrase that John Wellwood coined of spiritual bypass is an important phrase. It's not about having a calm, sweet life. It's about being alive in the face of what happens to you, because we don't know what's going to happen. Nobody guarantees our life. I hear situations almost every month where somebody suddenly falls ill and dies. You think you got a long life, but this might be the very last moment.
Right.
And to live our lives that way is what I call aliveness.
Something comes to me as you're talking, which is I think in terms of states of consciousness, that when one meditates, one in deep meditation, maybe after a long period of time or whatever it takes to go into that deepest place that you get to, where I think the full experience of what you're talking about is what you're experiencing, is what you're in. And yet we open our eyes, we start walking around, we start interacting with other people, and we're in a different state of consciousness, but we may retain some of the memory, some of this, even the sense, the feeling that it's here, that what we were experiencing in the deep meditation. How does that fit with how you share the experience of this aliveness? Is it different when you're in that deepest place at the beginning, at the creation, so to
It's
speak, and when you're involved with the mishigas of life?
it's like when you're in that deep meditation, it's the most, I can't think of the right word. The word curated comes up to me, but I don't know if that really expresses it. In other words, meditation, you know, I would say we do group meditation. So meditation in the Dharma hall is a little bit like going to the gym, and you work your muscles, and it's maybe the easiest place to connect with what you're talking about. But most people are not in the meditation hall most of the time.
Right.
So how to manifest it in your everyday life really becomes the harder practice. So I wouldn't call it a memory. I would call it more a manifestation of it.
Mm.
Again, a memory is a little bit too
Yeah,
far away.
right.
It's like, can I bring it now?
It's with you. Yeah,
I am it.
yeah,
It isn't with me. I am it.
yeah.
See,
But
that
that
actually,
I am it is you either are or you aren't in your
you are
awareness,
no matter what.
but in your awareness.
Yes, there's
Yeah,
a line from the sixth patriarch of Zen, a very critical Chinese Buddhist master of the 700s. He says, the only difference between an enlightened person and an ordinary person is that the enlightened person realizes it. But
yeah,
we say the essence of the Buddha's enlightenment is that he realized that he was it and everyone and
everyone is.
everything else is it.
Yeah,
So it's not about becoming something. It's not about becoming something different from ourselves. It's about connecting with our basic nature.
mhm,
So we're already it. Every single person listening right now is already it.
mhm.
It's just we don't know it, and we're afraid really to be it.
Yeah, and that's a big difference.
Yeah.
Yeah, just
You mean
circling back to
what's a big difference?
the knowing it or not.
Yes, the realizing it.
Yeah, the real. Yeah.
Yes and no, because common people are manifesting it all the time.
Uh-huh.
People get into a crisis situation and they're willing to sacrifice their life to help another person. That's not ordinary reality. And
Yeah.
yet it comes up even for ordinary people. So rather than think about it as there's this hard wall separating realizing it and not realizing it, I think it's better to look at it as all of us manifest these things all the time. And the more we realize it, it's not binary, it's a
Right.
continuum.
It's a
So that
spectrum. Yeah.
even the most ignorant person can sometimes manifest enlightenment.
I want to just circle back to a question that we touched on in the beginning. You know, I did write a book called Crossing the Boundary,
Yeah.
and it was about Jewish people born into Jewish families who became leaders of other spiritual paths. And one of the questions that I posed to a person who was a teacher of Hinduism or Buddhism, one version or another of Buddhism and shamanism and so forth, is and since you do question this thing, who am I, and you separate yourself, not separate yourself from, but you even talk about freedom from the self. Is Jeff Kitzes Bon Soeng still a Jew?
And the simple, easiest answer is yes.
Uh-huh.
I'm a member of the tribe, was born into the tribe. And even to be fair, culturally, I'm impacted by my upbringing, probably impacted by my DNA. And I am totally Jewish. I've never left being Jewish, but I don't practice the Jewish religion. And the way I grew up learning the Jewish religion, it was dead to me. It didn't have any energy. I'm sure there's plenty of Jewish practitioners now who would represent some of the aliveness that I'm interested in. I never had any reason to go back and look because I had found my own way, and that was enough.
Yeah.
But yes, I would consider myself a member of the Jewish tribe. And I don't think you cannot be that. It's like, well,
When you ask yourself, what am I? I know you go to what, but when you say, what
yeah,
am I? Is that included? Is that
it's everything is both and. There was a man, a baby named Jeff Kitz, who was named Jeff Kitzes by his parents, that was born from two parents who were of the Jewish tribe, and that DNA is passed on to me. So this body is an embodiment of what it means to be Jewish. And I can't change that. What I do with it, it's a little bit in a funny way like gender. You can say male, you can say female, but we all know now there's a continuum. A male can act any way. A female can act any way. You have infinite freedom. But, leaving out the question of trans for a moment, within that, you're free. So if you're called a woman, okay, that's a name, but who are you? What are you? That's an experience, and it's very different. So what you call something is not what it is. The Tao Te Ching, the opening line of the Tao Te Ching is the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. I'm way more interested in the eternal Tao than I am in the name. Name is a convenience. It points to something and there's a reality to it, but it's not the thing itself. That's so primary right at the beginning of our koan practice. We start to teach people, we'll hold up this cup, this glass, and we say, we call this a glass. But if you say it's a glass, I say you're attached to name and form. It's not a glass in China. It's not a glass in Italy. So if you think it's a glass, you're attached to name and form. But if you say it's not a glass, then I say you're attached to emptiness. So without being attached to name and form, and without being attached to emptiness, what is this? That's a very beginning koan, and it's a very important one. It actually is at the base of almost everything, because you break out of name and form and emptiness into just this moment.
Right. Um, so you've said in some of your talks, and I think kind of implied it here, that the awakened state of Zen is ordinary and distinct from mystical, and
Distinct
yet
from physical,
mystical,
mystical.
mystical, and but the experience of oneness with all that is almost the defining nature of mysticism. Uh, and it's not very ordinary to most people's experience. Um, so, um, what's that about? Why not mystical? What's why is not that experience of oneness um, mystical in the Zen sense?
It's a couple of ways I could answer that, but what jumps out at me is oneness is a name for something. And each moment, that oneness is different than the oneness of the moment before. If I'm eating dinner, that oneness is actually different than when I am struggling to push a rock up the hill. So my trouble, I suppose, with the word mystical is that it's a name that points to something, but it can be so easily reified and become part of the prison again. So it is a criticism that I've received that I'm too ordinary and not mystical enough. I'm paraphrasing it using your language. And it's a fair criticism. Myself, those deep oneness moments matter to me. I don't advise myself or others to chase after them. Oftentimes a student will have a deep experience. When I notice with people, those kind of deep experiences tend to wear off. I'm thinking of one guy who told me, we sat a long meditation retreat. He had some kind of opening. And for the next couple of weeks, it was as if his thinking mind went from foreground to background. And the more direct experience with the world was in the foreground. And it lasted a couple of weeks. And then he kind of went back to his old regular reality, except he was very impacted by that experience, and it still is impacting him today. But he's also still living as his ordinary experience. So it becomes a dangerous thing to chase after, because it could lead to frustration. It can lead to competition. You get a group of people together who are practicing together. One person says, I had this experience. The other person says, well, I didn't.
Yeah.
Then who's better, who's doing better, and it's all a distraction. So for each of us individually, yeah, those oneness, what you're calling a oneness experience is really, I mean, why else would we put ourselves through we sit
Exactly.
long meditation retreats. There
Yeah.
are people in Rhode Island right now and in Korea and in Hong Kong who are sitting 90-day retreats from 4:30 in the morning till 9:30 at night on a retreat schedule. That's it for 3 months. That's physically hard, emotionally hard, spiritually hard. In some ways, you're thrown through the ringer. So why would you do that if it didn't have some payoff of a wider, deeper, more organic, loving, kind experience? But it's a challenge when you're a teacher not to send people off on a
You don't
wild
want
goose
to
chase.
reify any state of
Exactly.
consciousness. Yeah.
Exactly.
So, kind of along similar lines, some traditions, as you know, some of the things I'm involved with, like Agni Yoga and shamanism, they call attention to what we think of as the intermediate realms. Some what exists between the material, ordinary world, and the oneness experience, the all that is the unity. Um, there's a focus, for example, on subtle energies, of chakras, of intermediate subtle bodies, of beings that can be spirit allies or healing agents, ancestor spirits. Is there any way in which Zen uh, relates to that? Any of that orientation, that focus of attention?
Yeah. I don't want to speak for Zen here. This is
Mhm.
really, as many teachers as there are many organizations as there are different styles of Zen. So I can't speak for Zen. It's not so much my way, so I don't teach it. But I will say that when we do these group trips in our international sangha, and we were in Korea and we were being shown around the head temple of the Choge order, which is the main order of Buddhists in Korea. Now remember, Zen is affiliated with Buddhism, but it's not all of Buddhism. And what the tour guide said to us is that Korean Zen, Korean Buddhism is a combination of Buddhism, Taoism, shamanism, and Confucianism. So if you take that palette, there's room for everything. I
Mhm.
remember being at one lovely temple in the mountains, Zen temple in the mountains in Korea, and then we took this path along the side of the mountain, and 10-minute walk, we were at this shaman's temple. They had Buddhas around, they used all the iconography of Buddhism, but they had magical water, they
Mhm.
had incantations. I
Mhm.
mean, and I don't want to limit shamanism to any of those things. It's not my area. But there's a part of me that I can feel connected to that. In some ways, I might be more Taoist than Buddhist. So the labels, it breaks down.
Yeah.
There's room for everything. So while it may not be my way, what do I know? I
Mhm.
only know what I know. I hate saying this because
Mhm.
it was that damn Donald Rumsfeld who I first heard it from. But he said, there are known unknowns and there are unknown unknowns. And that's a beautiful Zen phrase. You
Uh-huh.
don't know what you don't know.
Uh-huh.
So respect that. You can't say no to anything because you
Yeah.
don't know. It just
Yeah.
may not be your experience.
So I take it that includes an understanding about Zen, about death. Um, the m- many Buddhist teachings talk about reincarnation and um, bardos and so forth. And in your practice, is there a way in which one approaches death with an understanding that one's life, one's karma, one's energy will continue in some sort of individualized form to the extent that we're individuals now? I
Yeah,
know we're not
yeah,
really separate beings, but
yeah. That's a tough question for me. So I'll start off with the institutional answer. When my teacher died, I went to Korea for his funeral. And I've heard this a couple of other times. There's a very specific funeral ceremony.
Mhm.
And in that ceremony, you're trying to point whatever's left after death to the light. There's a lot of go this way, don't go that way. And reincarnation is definitely a part of the Buddhist tradition. I remember my teacher, Zen Master Seung Sahn, saying, if you brush shoulders with somebody on the street, it means you have 500 generations of karma with this person. My teacher spoke very directly to reincarnation. I think he would, sometimes he would speak about it a little bit differently. It's not your person that gets reincarnated, it's your karma that gets reincarnated. Honestly, I sidestep the whole issue. I have no better knowledge of whether there's reincarnation than you do. The teaching points to it. I myself go a little bit more, well, let's say my first image of death that spoke to me was from Suzuki Roshi in the book Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. He said, it's like a river, and the river is flowing, and the river is one thing. And then you hit a waterfall, and all the river breaks up into these little particles. And then when it hits the bottom, it becomes the river again. It actually was never separate. It's water is water is water. Life is life is life. Dharma, I don't even know what words to use. And there is a moment where you're an individual particle. And you have, lately when I look at science, they say that light is both a wave and a particle.
Yeah.
So from the individual perspective, I'm a particle. From the universal perspective, I'm just part of the wave. And I like the wave metaphor because it's an ongoing, it's moving.
Yeah.
A particle feels stationary and fixed, where the wave is moving. It's a process.
Yeah.
The other image
There's
that
a
I
lot
get,
there's a lot to unpack there.
yeah, a
But
lot.
I wanna go on to
Please.
another subject, which is that in addition to your role as a Zen teacher, a Zen master, in which you are fostering a kind of experience of freedom from self, you're a psychotherapist, and you're working with people who I assume are struggling with depression, anxiety, addiction, trying to have their personal selves relate more effectively in the world and have loving relationships and so forth. I know some people like use a spatial metaphor for these two different focuses or foci, I guess you say. Vertical being the spiritual work of awakening, of opening, releasing, letting go, and the horizontal being the work of maturing, becoming an effective and healthy individual human. Um, Many gurus, as I think we've seen, failed to do much maturing on the human level, even though they may have been very awakened spiritually. And many people involved in personal development really poo-poo spirituality completely and think it's a naive, foolish endeavor, waste of time, narcissistic. Um, so does your practice, say, being a psychotherapist, overlap with or integrate with your role as a Zen teacher? And are these two, if you agree that there are these sort of two paths or two directions for human life, come together?
Yes. I don't see it quite as separate as the way you described it. I think both Zen and psychotherapy are about liberation. And they're both about liberation from the trap of I, of myself. When I'm working with a psychotherapy, in the psychotherapy model, I do bring meditation in. Generally, I meditate 5 minutes with people to begin the session. And I want them to drop into a state that's bigger than their sense of self. And so, and most every client I work with knows knows that I'm a Zen practitioner. So I'm already making it very similar. I deal with the story a lot more in psychotherapy than I do in Zen, but sometimes the Zen students will come in and I'll deal with their story too. Because remember, I'm all about being present and alive in the moment. What better antidote to depression?
Mhm.
could there be to be present and alive? So I'm always looking at how our thoughts and beliefs and feelings are getting in the way. What I notice with all of us is we get stuck in a groove. We have certain beliefs that hold us hostage. And whether it's in psychotherapy or in Zen, I'm pointing those points of suffering, and I'm helping to open them so that life can come out of that.
Mhm.
So I'm really working with my clients to be more
Yeah.
alive. If I'm working with a couple, I'm not working with them so they'll stop fighting. I'm working with them so they'll be more real and alive with each other.
Mhm.
So I don't, and like you said, if spirituality is only vertical, you got a big problem, because a spiritual teacher can make a really big mess. There are
Yeah.
many
And they
people
have,
who are
yeah.
there are people who are dead because their spiritual teacher was not aware. I mean,
Mhm.
literally, it
Mhm.
happened, and it
Yeah.
continues to happen.
Yeah.
So,
Related to this is the fact that many of the, especially, well, Buddhism, for example, and Zen teachings come from the East, but they also come from cultures that were, at the time, were originating very hierarchical, patriarchal. There were kings, emperors, sovereign rulers of those lands, and the spiritual organizations, you could say, that developed tended to parallel that kind of hierarchy in a lot of ways, I think. And some people are saying that, well, maybe that's an old paradigm itself that grew out of those kinds of cultures, and that now, when we're at least uh, hopefully moving towards more democracy, that's tenuous as it is, we're as a sensibility, as an understanding that human beings are equal and should be allowed equal power, in a sense, over their lives. Um, you're in a lineage where you've taken on the mantle of master, um, and I wonder how do you see that, and how comfortable are you with the way your lineage was transmitted to you, and how you want to bring it out into the world?
well, one thing I'll say, being a master is a very heavy mantle to carry.
Mhm.
And, I'm a Westerner. I remember learning the phrase power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And nothing in my life has shaken my belief in that statement. I mean, I know I have to question my beliefs, so I don't want to trap myself. But my experience is, personally, I don't trust power. Um, Sometimes a criticism of me is perhaps I don't take it enough. I'm very comfortable taking on the power of the teacher in terms of being assertive in what I've learned and what I have to offer. I am not comfortable with power as over somebody.
Mhm.
And I'm very much on the side that you're talking about of human rights. Each person is uniquely themselves and they have the human right to be themselves. It's probably my most basic, even political belief. I'm very much, my friends laugh at me, they don't believe this, but I'm very much a civil libertarian. I think people need the right to live their own life, doing what they want to do, as long as they're not hurting others by doing it. I think I'm missing one piece of the question you asked me. Oh,
Well,
my teacher,
oh,
I like to watch documentary about cults. And what they say about cults is cults are high control organizations.
uh-huh.
I would advise almost anybody I know, it might work for you, go ahead, but if you're going to ask me, steer clear of a high control group. You
Mhm.
can have a powerful leader at the center as long as that powerful leader isn't controlling your reality.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
It's a tricky thing. I understand.
yeah, it's very
Yeah.
tricky. It's messy.
Yeah.
That's part of the full catastrophe. And sometimes people are really hurt by it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm sure sometimes people benefit from a cult. I can't speak to that. I haven't met that person
Mhm.
yet, but and many teachers.
I think temporarily people can learn things within a this is
Mhm,
my own opinion, maybe
mhm,
based on my own experience,
mhm,
having been with a group that was cultish, not
mhm.
cult, not a cult, but and I feel like I learned, it changed my
Right,
life in a very positive way in many
right,
respects. And I was able to leave, there was no
right,
restrictions on that.
right.
But I wanted to finally come to a question about where we are right now in the world. Um, I know we agree on the fact that human behavior right now is threatening the existence of many species of life, even the thin fabric of what we call civilization. Uh, Possibly human extinction is even on the horizon as a possibility. Meanwhile, wars and prejudice, injustice, massive displacement of people, intense polarization. Um, some people say that, like, the metaphor, maybe not exactly totally a metaphor, the world is burning. Do you encourage your students, or do you see them as maybe as a result of the compassion that they attune to through their Zen practice, moving more or less towards activism in addressing any of those kinds of issues?
More or less than what? I'm not sure, but
From the more or less from their previous activities and concerns.
yes, I guess. I hate to compare it because I can't, in some ways I can't remember. But I know that many people are very, very concerned with global warming. Some people are very politically active. Each individual, we as a group don't do a lot of activism.
Mhm.
Individuals in our group do what they feel is the right thing for them to do. When you were asking the question, I was almost going to say, now you're going to make me cry. So, what I'm encouraging people is to feel it. Don't hide from it. When Trump was elected in 2016, I had a talk with somebody the next day, and they said to me, they said, yeah, well, I figured this was going to happen.
Mhm.
And I was miserable. And you can think in Zen, you would say, I should be equanimous
Equanimous, yeah.
and be more like that person I was talking to.
Mhm.
But never in my life would I want to be that person.
Mhm.
My deep experience is what connects me to the world. To shrug my shoulders and not care is the deepest disconnection. So feel it, experience it, be it, and then find your way to do something about it.
Mhm. Mhm.
We, in our tradition, practice the Bodhisattva way. And the Bodhisattva way is essentially, I live my life for others. And it's theoretical, but it's actually experiential. Each moment I meet, what am I doing? In that moment, am I doing something that enhances the universe or takes away from it and makes it less? And so the moment of this very moment shows me how to help the world. And everybody has their own proclivities. Everybody has their own way. It's not for me to tell people how to do it. It's for me to help them be there and be open and ready. And then do it your way, but do it.
I was going to ask you to, if you had any final thoughts, but that seems just perfect right there. So I want to just thank you, my good friend, my brother, Jeff Bon Soeng, and I will be posting links to access Empty Gate Zen Center and Jeff's Dharma talks, where you can hear more of directly of his teachings when I post the YouTube video and podcast. Um, so thanks again. Thank you all for listening, and blessings to may all beings be happy, free, safe,
And alive.
and alive and aware. Yes. Okay.